Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Enabling Cloud-First Healthcare Integration. My name is Mark Hagland. I'm Editor-in-Chief of Healthcare Innovation. Today's program is sponsored by IntraSystems. Thank you so much to our friends at IntraSystems and to you and our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, I have just a few housekeeping details to share with you. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. You do not have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, join our webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag #HILiveWebinar. And at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's program. Alex McLeod, Director of Healthcare Solution Innovation at IntraSystems, and Jessica Jowdy, Manager, Healthcare Sales Engineering at IntraSystems. During her career with IntraSystems, Alex has worked in roles within implementation, support, and sales with a wide range of clients in both government and private sectors in a number of international markets, including Germany, South Africa, the UK, and the US. Jessica is Manager of Healthcare Sales Engineering and is in her 8th year at IntraSystems. In her role, she has been intimately involved with integration technology across different healthcare verticals, including the provider, payer, government, and life science sectors. It is my pleasure to welcome both presenters, and the floor is yours.
Okay, so enabling cloud-first healthcare integration actually has a lot of words in it, and I wanted to take a moment to just talk about cloud in general before we dive into integration engines in particular. So why is everyone talking about cloud, doing cloud, wanting to do cloud? Because it's kind of taken off, and Gartner is one of the analyst firms predicting that in another 2 years, more than half of all enterprise workloads will run through the cloud in one way or another. So we got to ask ourselves, why is that? So there's a couple of economical benefits. You usually don't have a high upfront fee. It's more of a pay-as-you-go type of model. So it's, you don't have to provision these big data centers and this infrastructure that might then just sit there unused. You're really just paying for what you're consuming as you're using it. And that's attractive to a lot of people because, it could peak one day and then be kind of more mellow the next couple of months. So you're really only being charged for, what you need at that moment. From an operational side, there's similar benefits. So you don't need those skilled IT people that manage this infrastructure. You can really focus on what you're good at, your core business competency, writing your interfaces, for example. You don't have to have that skill set anymore and learn either, infrastructure, security, physical hardware, scalability, high availability. That all comes with the cloud already, and you typically get to value way faster because the automation provided through the cloud is pretty rapid. The vendor typically takes care of a lot of it behind the scenes. They upgrade for you, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Strategically, there's also a bunch of benefits because now you have your people focusing on what your business really wants to do and what they're good at. And the idea is you pivot to innovate faster, right? So you can now compose these different services, plug and play them together more easily, and go into new business models that you might not have looked at before. So let's talk about integration next, but I do want to take a moment for those of you who don't know us to talk about who is IntraSystems and why do we have an opinion on integration. But we're a privately held company. We've been in business for
45 years.
45?
Yeah.
I was going to say 40 plus because I never remember. But we operate globally, which you see indicated there by the green or turquoise type of coloring of that world map. And we really focus on data platform technology. So if you look at the systems that run on our technology, we handle about 1 billion patient records in one way or another. So either through an end user system that we installed, or through a partner application. We'll talk about that in a minute a little bit, but 80% of our business in healthcare. So that's what Jess and I live and breathe every day. So, and I just mentioned end users versus partners. We really run the gamut of the healthcare ecosystem in terms of who we work with. So we deal with providers and payers directly. We work with software vendors like an Epic that build applications on top of our technology and then resell that. And then we, work with other organizations like governments, that's, country and statewide exchanges, for example, medtech, pharma, life sciences, labs. So we see it from all different angles, which keeps it interesting for us. Now, healthcare integration is actually kind of unrelated to the cloud, has been, I don't want to say an issue, but something we've worked on solving for a couple of decades, because we just have all these different systems and applications in place, and they all talk different formats. And that's here to stay, I think. Yeah. FHIR is a nice idea, but HL7 is still around and has been for a long, long time. So how do you do this? You don't usually build point-to-point connections anymore. People buy interface engines traditionally on-premise. But there's this integration platform in the middle that knows how to connect these systems, transform between different formats, and make it all seamlessly work together. Now, when you move that to the cloud, it's still the same problem and kind of the same solution set, but the key focus areas change a little bit, or what our customers are looking for changes just a little bit in terms of emphasis that they put on certain things. So one is the automation that I mentioned in the cloud. You're expecting kind of a self-service deployment portal where you can quickly spin up these systems and they're up and running, and you can really start building your interfaces. Same for upgrades, right? You want the vendor to do this automatically behind the scenes more frequently, so the cadence increases, but it should be, how do I say this? Seamless, but give you enough control at the same time where you're not surprised by an upgrade. Your interfaces will still work, so it's this like delicate balance you have to kind of walk. People get very nervous, I think I would too, if you put your data in the cloud, right? So how does it stay secure? Does it not get intermingled with other people's interface engines? So there needs to be an understanding and somewhat of a transparency of where does my data go? Is this a dedicated environment? How is it secured with a vendor that has experience in that arena? And then long-term maintenance of these interfaces changes too, right? So if I have an on-premise interface engine, I might be used to looking at a dashboard or getting an alert. Now I'm expecting the vendor to take care of a lot of that stuff and be alert for me, but bring me in quickly enough when there is an issue with one of my interfaces that I'm responsible for, right? So it needs to be very easy to understand, needs to be fast, and it needs to be 24/7, basically. And now you also typically don't have these instances installed on every developer's laptop anymore. You have a cloud instance that everyone works in collaboratively. So how do you manage that so that you don't step on each other? You can work jointly, you can promote between environments and take advantage of some of the more cloud native tool sets around this. But these are all things that, were sort of important in an on-premise environment, but they become kind of key once you're moving to a cloud vendor. And Jess, do you want to take us through some of these in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's some myths though that we want to debunk first.
Good point. So, and I already mentioned the first one of these. So if I put my data in the cloud, do I lose control over it? Now it's not my data anymore. What does the vendor do with this data? That's actually not typically true. So the vendor runs the infrastructure, manages the product platform, so backups, availability, and all that stuff for you, but you own your data, your application, and that, you govern that. The vendor typically does not have any rights to that data. It's also for interface engines, there's no long-term storage typically of that data either. So it doesn't stick around for secondary usage or anything. It gets maintained for a week or 4 weeks for operational purposes. So you can resend and monitor and maintain the interface, but there's no long-term persistence typically. And then, some of the fee structures that I mentioned earlier that are attractive, where you pay consumption-based, people are often afraid that there's a lot of hidden fees and they don't understand it because it looks so complicated, which is true. The other concern, I think, is predictability of those fees. So while it's nice that I'm only paying for what I use, now I don't have each month my bill is going to be this. So you really want to look for a service that has very transparent and simple pricing tied to a metric that you can kind of relate and sort of predict still what it's going to cost you over the long term. And then the other thing is, well, if I now move to the cloud, will that not result in job cuts and morale issues? I think the focus of the people you have just changes, right? So now they get to do interfaces. You might not need these infrastructure people anymore. Those skills are needed somewhere else, and like on the vendor side or on the cloud side where they take care of the infrastructure. But you really get to focus now on doing more interesting work, and everyone is short on staff. So this should actually free up some talent to do these things that you haven't had time for before. Plus, people get excited about the cloud. It's a marketable skill set, so they advance their careers that way. And that, attracts new talent. So I think that those are all good things.
Yes.
But they are certainly scary when you first think about them.
And to Alex's point, we do have some things we like to keep in mind for those who are new to the cloud or new to integration engines being in the cloud that we like to consider. This is having worked with a lot of new organizations that were new to the cloud. We've come up with some key considerations to keep in mind when you consider moving to the cloud. The first is around networking. I think there is an assumption that if I am moving to the cloud, then my vendor is going to take care of all of my behind the scenes work, which some people incorporate or include networking in that. And while vendors can play a significant role in helping you with your networking situations, a lot of times you're connecting to on-prem applications and systems, and that can't be completely on the vendor to do. They don't have access to your internal network, and that's on purpose, right? So there is this networking step that's required to make sure that all of your systems are connected. A few things that are different. In an on-prem integration engine, you're usually connecting to your EMR, and usually you don't need a VPN for that. Some people don't even use a TLS connection because it's all within that internal network. Once you move it outside the cloud, every single connection you want to think about is being encrypted because it's all living within that cloud. So whether you're doing it as a VPN connection, whether you're using TLS, you have to do something, right? Because it's all going to that cloud environment. Firewall rules are also important for inbound and outbound traffic. And then you also want to consider the fact that when you're doing these connectivity points, you have to do it for your development environment, your test environment, your production environment. Sometimes those are going to be a little bit different. Sometimes you have to redefine those firewall rules. A lot of integration platform vendors, or I should say some integration vendor platforms, actually have tools and accelerators to make this process simple. So as you're evaluating your network configurations, you want to look for tools that will make this process a lot more seamless and fast. Another consideration that people take into account when they're moving to the cloud is when you're dealing with more SaaS-based offerings, there is maybe a myth of sorts that you have to work in more of a black box model. And when you work in a black box model, there's a limitation on the kinds of functionality that you're allowed to do because now a vendor is servicing this environment and I'm only allowed to color within the lines that the vendor is now allowing me to do.
That's a nice analogy.
Yeah. and so, and some of this comes with going into the cloud, but mature cloud integration platforms should still have ways that allow you to color outside of the lines. When I'm saying inside the lines with healthcare integration, that might be like basic HL7 work, right? Being able to do basic transformations and routing. But what we're finding, and it kind of goes back to what Alex was saying, is when you take away that responsibility of having to manage an environment, you free up resources to be able to do other levels of innovation and work on other kinds of projects. So you get into working with X12 for the first time, or API development or things like that. And now, you don't want your integration engine to be limited in that. You now have the resources that you can actually build something. So when you're evaluating your movement to the cloud, you want to make sure that you're operating with that mindset of prioritizing flexibility without sacrificing usability. Portability is an interesting one, and I kind of use this term generally. When you're moving from an on-prem integration engine to a cloud integration engine, there is a migration of sorts, right? Because you are picking up your interfaces and dropping them off in the cloud. So that can mean a lot of different things. The first thing that people tend to evaluate is, do I actually have to rewrite anything? Am I able to just pick everything up and stick it down, or am I doing some kind of transformation of my interfaces? Other things to consider, some organizations have standardized on cloud providers, or they're evaluating different types of cloud providers. So picking engines that can be portable and move between different cloud providers becomes really helpful if you're still in that evaluation stage. Phasing your go lives when you're moving into the cloud. Most people don't like to just say, let's do it all at once and have a really exciting 2 a.m. time. Usually it's some kind of structure. With that said, some people do, we call them a big bang go live. So trying to structure, your integration engine is, the lifeblood of your entire IT system in healthcare, right? So you want to make sure you're minimizing your downtime and making this migration process really seamless. And then, do I need third-party services to actually help me with this, or is this something that I can do all in-house? And that's dependent on the kinds of on the talent and the skills that you have in-house, as well as the time that you've dedicated to this project. Maybe you have to have this done in a few months. Maybe you have a couple years. It's dependent on your schedule. Some people also use a movement from on-prem to cloud as a time to evaluate their current integration engine vendor. And in which case, it's not just a movement to on-prem to cloud, it might actually be modernizing their integration engine technology or things like that. So if you're in that second bullet as well, as you're looking at moving to the cloud, you might want to see if your vendor has any tools to help you migrate interfaces faster. Maybe you're moving from a more legacy engine, you don't want to have to rewrite everything. Are there any optimizations or accelerations that I can use? And then what kind of support, what kind of training do I get to make sure that I can seamlessly migrate everything over?
Yeah. Without having Jess on speed dial.
Yeah, without having someone like me on speed dial, absolutely. And that brings us to our last point, which is vendor responsibilities and support. And this is something that Alex also brought up. The responsibility matrix of sorts is redefined in a vendor-hosted cloud-based integration environment. You are no longer necessarily responsible for doing things like backups and upgrades and things of that nature, but you are responsible for still building the interfaces potentially and maintaining them. So having a good understanding of what that responsibility matrix is will make you feel a lot more confident in the offerings that you have. Beyond that, being very understanding SLAs, RPOs, RTOs, and those kinds of like uptime requirements for your environment will help you better understand, the criticality of the environment, how it's being serviced. And then you really want to make sure, more so in a cloud-based environment than any, that you're partnering with a vendor that optimizes and really dedicates themselves to client success. You are putting a very critical part of your IT infrastructure in the hands of a vendor, right? You really want to make sure you feel comfortable with that vendor will take care of that engine. It is like the heartbeat, as I said. So, you really want to evaluate the vendor as well as the offering that the vendor has.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
And let's look at, because there's usually a scale that these cloud offerings run at, like of how much am I responsible for versus the vendor. Right. And I'll talk about it from our perspective and how we bucket our offerings, but I think the terminology is generally applicable.
Yeah.
But if we start at the bottom, right? So there is always this model where it's bring your own license. So you're purchasing software, and just as in an on-premise arrangement, you just install in the cloud vendor if you're choosing. It's your cloud tenant. You manage the infrastructure, or maybe use the cloud vendor to do some of that. But we, as the software vendor or the vendor of the interface engine, really don't get involved more than selling you a license, right? And then typical product support. So that's kind of the lightweight for us, heavy on you type of model. One step up from that are the more traditional managed services. We see this a lot for complex solutions where it's enterprise applications and a bunch of them that are integrated with each other, where we as the vendor manage the cloud infrastructure, we install it in our tenant, we manage the product environments, and now we're taking care of high availability and DR, SLAs, backups, all that type of stuff, but you're responsible for the application layer. So And you could have a partner to help you, implement some of that, but it's really up to you still to monitor your interfaces and do that type of work. And then all the way at the top of the pyramid are cloud services, and that model is more click, click, go, right? So it's a very thin slice offering typically that satisfies a very particular use case. You can compose these services. And again, it runs in the vendor's tenant. So ours, for example, we manage all of the infrastructure and the product for you. And you get to, depending on the type of service you buy, you might still develop applications or create database schemas or write interfaces. So you have a very specific piece of functionality that you're taking care of. But it's a very targeted use case traditionally. So if we look at our examples, for example, we have horizontal services at the bottom that are kind of applicable across verticals or market segments. So these are, for example, like Iris Cloud SQL, we could sell it to healthcare or non-healthcare, right? So it doesn't really matter. They're not specific to any particular segment. Then we have vertical services built all around FHIR. We have vertical services built all around interoperability. And that's where Health Connect Cloud as an integration platform in the cloud falls, for example. And then you can compose them together, right? So maybe you need an MPI that you need to plug in with your interface engine, or Jess mentioned the trouble with networking. It sounded kind of daunting, but Network Connect, for example, is kind of this VPN hub that you can hook up to your corporate network. So you can then kind of build them together like Lego blocks, that fit nicely, but are very, very digestible, right? They're not these enterprise application, mammoth applications anymore. You really pick and choose like from a menu. And I'll let Jess go into Health Connect Cloud in particular, because that's the topic we're here to talk about.
Yeah. So as an example of a cloud-based integration engine, we can speak to our own, which is our Health Connect Cloud. It is a PaaS offering, and what we essentially allow our customers to do is have that same kind of flexibility in development and that same scalability that our Health Connect integration engine is known for, but taking away that client responsibility of having to manage that environment. And so put it in the cloud. Interface engineers go into a web-based environment. They're able to do the development that they're comfortable with, and then we'll take care of all of the other tasks that are typically required to service an environment like this. There's a few things that we can highlight specifically with Health Connect. We'll talk about a little bit the development nature of it, and then the automation that we include as well. So from the automation standpoint, or the development and automation standpoint, one of the things that we recognize with people going to Health Connect and Health Connect Cloud, and I kind of talked about this earlier, is it can be a really daunting process to go through a migration. As we'll keep saying it, integration engines are the heartbeat of any kind of health system. And there's usually a lot of interfaces that need to get migrated. And so that's a big project. We're not saying this is going to take a couple weeks, right? And that can be daunting at times. So what InterSystems has taken the approach of is how much of this can we actually automate, where we're really reducing the burden on the engineer and increasing their productivity. So the way that we go about this whole development process is, obviously we're a UI first development. We'll get into that first, but before anyone even has to go and click a button to develop anything, let's see how far we can get someone along the way. So we introduce what we call migration tools that can automate the creation of connections, skeletons of interfaces. So that would include like, where do messages get routed? Schemas, custom schemas, because we all love those Z segments and HL7 messages. Data transformations, which is really the bulk of the time that we see interface engineers taking is in building those mappings. So, are we able to automate the creation of if I have a set of inbound and outbound messages, how quickly can I build that data transformation? Or do we have, specific transformation tools from other kinds of engines that we can bring into this picture? So we built a lot of those migration tools, and then the very end, that production verifier becomes really helpful when you're doing things like upgrades. Now we do the upgrades, but it's still a great checkpoint for interface engineers to validate that post upgrade, your interfaces are still running just like they did before. That's something we recommend for anyone that's going through this process. And so very quickly, we're able to, verify that messages look the same as they get passed through, and you can kind of check that box and move on to what you were doing before the upgrade started. So really, it frees up development time, and it results in faster project deliveries, which is 2 thumbs up.
Yep. And I think we partnered with a strong cloud vendor too, and AWS, for example, especially for migrations, has specific programs too that we participate in that makes it economically more attractive, but also from a workload perspective, easier, more efficient for you to actually move to the cloud, because it is a daunting step. Now, the reason we partnered with AWS on this, there's a couple of reasons really, but they're very, the customer demand is strong because AWS has kind of proven what they can do with infrastructure security. They have high trust certification on their end of the operational business. They're globally available, which for us is key as we are operating in these different regions, and I'll have an international example for you in a second. But so I think it makes for a nice partnership where we're available in the cloud portal through a self-service deployment tool, very easy to use. We can be purchased directly through us or through the marketplace, so people can take advantage of their corporate agreements with AWS that they might already have in place. So it's just kind of more seamless for people dealing with us in this partnership. And they really only have to deal with us. Right. But it's comforting to know that the cloud vendor behind is a strong one, I believe. So let's just talk about 2 customers as examples of what they had to go through. And they happen to go with our interface engine, but it really, I think it speaks to what people take into consideration, like you were talking about before, when they move to the cloud. So the first example is from the UK. The NHS, which is the National Health System over there, actually has a big cloud first strategy. And they've been, over the last couple of years, building these what they call integrated care systems, which really encompasses healthcare providers and social care, which is huge over there because they really want to get people in the community before they get admitted to hospital, for example. But so the goal is better integration between all these different entities. So Northwest London is one of these ICSs that handles about 2.4 million citizens as a population size, and they already had on-premise interface engines. And that was a mixture of vendors. It wasn't one particular vendor. But so now they wanted to move to the cloud, for a couple of different reasons. One is, well, why do we have all these different interface engines? We can't pool our staff, right? We have all these different integration teams. Every time a new trust comes on, we need to hire more skilled people there. We need to manage the infrastructure. It distracts us from building interfaces. So they consolidated into a single cloud instance in AWS. And that has a couple of advantages. A, they don't have to do, these data centers anymore. They have one pool of resources now and do shared interface development and then reuse those interfaces across the different healthcare organizations. And if they have to bring on someone new or another ICS or another trust, that is way more seamless because they don't have to buy a license. They don't have to hire staff. They don't have to get a data center in place. So it's just more convenient and efficient this way. They've been live for a while. I don't remember exactly how long the migration took, but keep in mind, it wasn't just a migration from one hospital. It was like this consolidation of these different interface engines into one cloud engine. So I think that's a pretty nice story.
Great story. From the US, we're going to keep this one anonymized, but it's kind of a similar challenge in a different scale. Instead of being in different regions, this particular client had multiple integration engines internally that handled different types of interfaces. They wanted to consolidate that work. They also found that they were getting they were restricted in the resources that they had. So they knew they wanted to replace their engine, but they weren't sure they had the resources to continue servicing that engine moving forward. So they thought of this as a good opportunity. You know what? I'm already evaluating that replacement of an integration engine. Let me put in that requirement for it to be a cloud hosted environment. And so they evaluated a number of different vendors. What they were really focused on was definitely the servicing of that cloud integration platform. So high availability strategies and system uptimes and those responsibility matrices that we talked about. They were also very concerned with how they would be, any restrictions that would be put on their development. They had visions of leveraging fire in the future, of doing, more complex processes and workflows, and they didn't want to be restricted in their ability to do that. So they partnered with InterSystems and leveraged this Health Connect cloud solution that we've talked about a little bit today to be able to kind of bring all of that together. We manage that environment for them, and they've spent their time migrating their interfaces and starting to build net new projects that can support other kinds of development that they haven't been able to do in the past. So, we just want to give you a couple examples. We could probably have gone for hours just talking about, different scenarios that we've seen, but just in closing and to wrap up on some of the points that Alex and I have talked about today, there's obviously rapidly growing interest in evaluating and adopting cloud technologies. You're probably hearing this today from your own leadership, and that can be exciting and daunting. Cloud technologies have come a long way over the last 5 or 10 years. They've evolved in their security, their scalability, their resiliency. A lot of vendors have come to adopt and build their platforms and their technologies on top of these solutions or these cloud technologies. So there's a lot that has happened in the last decade to really evolve cloud capabilities. With that said, as you go on this journey, you want to make sure that you're taking into account what's new when you go into the cloud. It's not going to operate exactly like your on-prem solution. So you just want to be armed with the right questions to ask and the right considerations to keep in mind. So take some time to familiarize yourself. We brought up a few today. But, ask around, talk to us, talk to, anyone who might have already adopted cloud solutions and see what some of their key considerations were. And then the last thing I'll say is vendor offerings do vary. So make sure you evaluate the application that you're deploying as well as the vendor that's supporting it, because as we've said a few times, you're putting your trust in the vendor to now service this really important technology. You want to trust the solution as much as you trust the vendor.
And I would say even before the support, like 5 years ago, I thought healthcare will never go into the cloud.
Yeah.
Like, it's just scary, it's scary, it's different. I still shy away from any time someone wants my consent to put my data in the cloud, right? But it's happening, and it's happening surprisingly fast. And I think you want a vendor that acts almost as a consultant, and kind of walks you through what this means for you and for your organization, for your practices, and then it'll become less scary. We're all learning together, but I'm pretty excited. It's exciting and it's doable, and we've seen customers do it now. So let's go together.
Yeah, let's do it. So we'll take any questions at this time.
Well, thank you so much. That was really great, Alex and Jessica. What we're going to do actually is I am going to ask a couple of survey questions, poll questions, and we'll get the audience's response, and then we'll delve into direct questions from audience members. But audience, if you can be ready and give us your response. The first question we have to ask you is, how would you rate your organization's integration strategy on a scale of 1 to 5? And we will see what everyone says, and we'll provide our results in just a second here. So I am relying on behind the scenes backup because I'm having a little bit of a technological problem here. But in a minute, we should have, oh, here we go. I actually can see this. Great. So, so far, here's what we've got. So going from 1 to 5, how would you rate your organization's integration strategy? 11% are saying it's a 1. 11% are saying it's a 2. 44% are calling their strategy a 3. 22% are calling it a 4. And 11% are calling it a 5. Jessica and Alex, what do you think?
I think that's probably pretty representative of what we typically hear out there as we're talking to customers and prospects, so it all seems pretty normal. It's kind of across the board,
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now I'm going to ask a second question, which is your organization struggling to connect fragmented systems? And the possible answers are yes, somewhat, and no. And we'll give the audience a moment to respond to that. Okay, so I'm going to look for the results here. Let me see if they appear. Here we go. Okay. Is your organization struggling to connect fragmented systems? 40% say yes. 20%, oops, it's changing. 36% say yes. 27 to 28% say somewhat. 36% say no. That's interesting. Alex and Jessica, what do you think?
Well, I think it makes sense in the case that you always start off with your kind of straightforward interfaces that you're familiar with. And as you tackle those maybe standard interfaces or those standard integrations, you get into more complicated ones and you start dealing with applications and systems with, ways of communicating that you might not be familiar with. So what I really like about the integration space is it continues to evolve and there's always new challenges in building out those interfaces. So I think that kind of result makes sense.
Yeah. Alice, do you want to add to that at all?
No, I think Jess summed it up well. I think that's
okay.
Point well made.
Great. Okay, and then we do have the results for our third survey question. Is your healthcare system gaining momentum in a cloud strategy? I wanted to know that. So 45% said yes, 36% said somewhat, and 18% said no. That sounded kind of good to me, right? Presenters, what do you think?
I think everyone's on their own.
I think that, it's a very low percentage actually.
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
Sorry. I think it's a low percentage that says no, and the majority is somewhat or yes. And that's, that's pretty, that jives with what we were just talking about, I think.
Yeah, it does. Jessica, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree with Alex completely on that one.
Yeah, that's positive. And I, first of all, everything that both of you said in your presentation was excellent. And it also accords with what I'm hearing out in the field as a journalist, that, this is a journey, right? And in fact, let me ask you that question. If you look at this in terms of the classic philosophical, journey of 1,000 miles, and where are we, do you think, right now? I mean, we're all over the place. Obviously, different organizations are in different places, but it seems very clear. And I know, Alex, you said this in the presentation. Seems very clear that we're in a different place from where we were even 2 years ago, and we will be in a different place from where we are now in 2 years. Presenters, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's right. So I think we're past this kind of, if you look at a curve, we're probably past the early adopter, where it's just the kind of crazy risk takers that jump on the bandwagon for anything. I think we're past that. So it's gained momentum already. But I think we're all still learning. So people want to do it, but we're all still figuring out what that means. And especially for enterprise applications that, like startups is a little bit of a different story. If you develop from the ground up for the cloud, that's different. But if you're used to running your enterprise workload on premise, that's a complete mind shift. It's very different behavior. It's cultural, it's technological. There's a lot that flows into it. And I think that's what we're seeing right now. But everyone is kind of pulling in the same direction.
That makes sense. Jessica, would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, I agree that, we're all kind of going in that same direction. Everyone's going at different speeds based on how this technology is being adopted within their own organization and their own initiatives. But I think we're all rowing in the same direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. So here's a question for you both. Where are leaders of patient care organizations stumbling the most right now?
I think that's an excellent question. I think, there's a couple things that come into it, but especially healthcare, I think we're later than some other industries for good reason, because the nature of the data is just so specific and so, precious. I'm trying to look for words. But, security is a big concern. And then once you get, even now that I think we've proven that security is actually solid and has been established in the cloud, culturally and emotionally, there's still kind of a hurdle for people to get to that point where it's normal to have healthcare data in the cloud. And I think it's more that than any technology question.
Interesting. Jessica?
Well, I mean, I think it's a good question. It's also a very broad question, right? There's a lot of different avenues that can act as barriers to adoption of cloud technologies. I think it's great that so many vendors in the healthcare IT space have invested time and energy over the last, 5 or 10 years, really developing solutions that take advantage of what the cloud has to offer. And now that those are pretty well-established technologies, we're seeing organizations start to adopt them within the healthcare space. So it's an exciting time that we live in, and I think we're going to start seeing that shift really soon.
Okay. Great. All right. Let's ask, those are questions really from me, but we have a few questions from the audience. One is, hang on, can you please speak more about how a non-cloud environment interface is converted to a cloud-to-cloud interface once an organization converts to the cloud?
Yeah, I can take that one. It's an interesting question. I think it depends on what that non-cloud interface looks like, right? So if we think of we'll call it an on-prem interface, right? That on-prem interface is connecting two different systems. Those two different systems might be on-prem. One might be in the cloud to on-prem, or they could be both cloud-based systems that you're connecting. When you move that into the cloud, the connected systems don't change in that regard. What might change is the network connectivity to allow that cloud integration engine to connect to those different systems, but the interface itself doesn't necessarily change unless those applications or systems that you're connecting to have also been moved from, for instance, an on-prem environment to the cloud. Now, there are some additional technologies once you're working with cloud-based applications that you might be able to leverage, whether you're working directly with integrating with cloud-based data stores or things like that. But from at a high level, just simply moving a non or an on-prem interface from a on-prem environment to a cloud-based environment doesn't necessarily change the nature of that interface. It's really dependent on those two different systems that you're connected to.
That's a great answer. Alex, do you want to add to any of that?
No, I think Jess got it. It's networking. It's mostly the protocol end that might change. So maybe you had a file-based backload or batch type of message before, and now you're using S3 buckets. Or, that's kind of the stuff that you need to think about. The interface logic itself doesn't typically change. The other thing you should look at is, are there egress charges that are kind of baked in already? As you're sending data outside of the cloud environment, you will get charged for that, and that's where you want some of that transparency we've been talking about the pricing structure. So just something to keep in mind.
Okay. And here's another audience question. So pricing is usually based on utilization and based on application architecture utilization. Can be cloud compliant or not. Will you discuss or cover application architecture aspects that help to optimize cloud utilization? So take that in any direction that makes sense.
So this we could probably talk about for hours and hours. One of the advantages of the interface engine, or when you're buying an application, right, it's the responsibility of the vendor to kind of optimize that application or the interface engine to take advantage of the more cloud native capabilities. Or if you're an application developer, you will have to consider that. If you're an end user, you have to kind of trust that the vendor does that. But there's a couple of different things you can look at that will directly influence pricing. So one is auto scaling of the application, right? So when you use less, will the application actually scale down and not take up a certain amount of storage or a certain number of cores or something like that? So it should scale up and down based on demand. You want to tie it ideally into to be able to do that type of consumption-based pricing. You want to take advantage of capturing those metrics, ideally tying into the cloud vendors' billing APIs. So that's all automated. There's a couple other things like, do you have tiered storage where some data can be stored in cheaper storage, and you can take advantage of those. But again, there is so many things there that we could talk about that the vendor is responsible for. But if you want to have a conversation, we're certainly happy to schedule kind of a workshop to walk you through that.
Wonderful. Jessica, do you want to add to that at all?
Just that there's a lot of options to be able to make use of cloud native technologies, and I think it's a great opportunity to be able to, as Alex talked about earlier in the webinar, pay as you go and only pay for what you need at the time, and the cloud kind of gives us that opportunity to take advantage of that. So it's great, and really excited to have that technology.
Great. All right. Well, we have two more questions. The first is, I'm really worried about being able to troubleshoot in a cloud environment that's inherently stateless. So what should I keep in mind or look out for?
And that's actually also a really good point if you're familiar with, some of those cloud native capabilities that vendors do usually take advantage of. Some of it is, stateless containers and stuff like that, but you still want to be able to at least have some data stored operationally somewhere without incurring huge storage costs, but have it stored so that for operational purposes, you're able to trace the messages through the system, see what was transformed, how you can resend from that point. Maybe you can do, for billing alone, that data needs to be counted somewhere. So it needs to be somewhat persistent, at least, temporarily. Those are kind of the questions to ask, I would say.
Wonderful. Jessica, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Alex summed that up very nicely.
Okay, great. So we have one other question, and obviously either of you can respond or both. And that is, hang on, okay. I'm trying to figure out what resources and how many resources I need to take on a project of this magnitude. Any ideas or thoughts on how I might go about figuring that out?
Yeah, I think that there's it's both an art and a science in that respect. I think it's there's not a one size fit all for the number of resources that you need, and I think it's very dependent on what your timeline looks like for doing a project like this. As far as the types of resources, obviously you have your integration team involved, typically have your ops team involved. We talked about the importance of having networking folks. We do recommend that there's internal knowledge of how the cloud architecture is structured, even though it's not being managed by the organization. It does give some peace of mind on how that system operates. And it also depends on the number of interfaces that you're looking to migrate or port over to the cloud, whether those are being maintained in the same integration engine vendor solution that's now being hosted in the cloud, or if you actually have to or if you're looking to migrate that into a new technology or new vendor solution. So there's a lot of different things to consider. We've seen these projects be rather speedy for organizations that are trying to take advantage of the cloud really quickly, and they are able to, reallocate certain resources to that project temporarily to make it go faster. Some organizations don't have that flexibility and things can take a little bit longer. So it kind of depends. The length of time is dependent on the situation, the timeline. But resource-wise, those are the types of resources that we typically see playing a role.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And one more audience member came in with a question, which I'll ask you, and then we'll move towards wrap up. And that question is, what is the greatest risk for an organization converting to the cloud?
That's also a great question. I think the thing that pops into my mind first is, especially taking into account everything we've just been talking about, is don't expect it to be the same. If you're expecting this to be, you're just moving locations basically, I don't think you're going to be very happy or satisfied. It's you really need to. It's almost a change management type of project, because things will change, and they'll be hopefully for the better. This is an opportunity, I think, in that process to change things to be more efficient, because especially with interface engines, some of these interfaces haven't been touched in years or decades. They don't have proper documentation, so I think it's an opportunity. But you do need to be prepared to kind of energize your organization around this being good change.
That really makes a lot of sense. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Jessica?
No, nothing more to add to that. I think we've used the word daunting a bunch of times in this presentation. I think the greatest risk is being uninformed on what the cloud can do for you, and how you interact with it. So getting educated, building up that internal resource pool of knowledgeable of cloud system administrators and things like that. Because when we're talking about converting to the cloud, today's presentation was really focused on integration engines in the cloud, right? But there are organizations that are going through a full conversion to the cloud across all of the different applications and systems that they're working with. So really building up that knowledge base and getting that confidence internally is going to go a long way.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm about to conclude, but I'll just offer each of you a minute. Any closing thoughts that our audience should be aware of?
And we talked about this being different and being a change and being kind of a big undertaking. I think this is possibly, and I'm trying to think back if there's been anything that I would consider this big in the time I've spent in this industry, and I don't think there has been, which makes it more exciting. And I think it'll really better things in the long term, yeah, again, as so many projects, it's not just a technology or an IT project. So we're happy to work with you if you have questions. But it's very exciting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Jessica, any last thoughts?
No, I guess, we're really excited to be on this journey with you. Reach out to us if you have any questions. We're happy to connect and kind of give you some feedback on what we've seen in the space and what works well and how we might be able to help.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation and a great discussion here, Alex and Jessica. So this has been great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank both Alex and Jessica for today's excellent webinar. And also, I'd like to thank our friends at InterSystems for making today's program possible. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone in our audience for joining us. We hope you'll join us again in the future for another healthcare innovation webinar. This concludes today's presentation. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.